Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, Red Ribbon Slim. My name is Serena, and usually this is the point of the video where I'd have an introduction. However, my video and sound doesn't seem to be working together, but I'm capable of doing a voiceover. So today's video, we're going to be doing a upcycle. We're going to take boots that we already have, or possibly cheaper boots that you find in store, and turn them into vintage boots with a little bit of fur trim. I hope you enjoy this video. And thanks to my technical difficulties, we'll be able to get straight into the video. So you're going to take your piece of trim and go ahead and cut it in half. You can go ahead and mark this, but I went ahead and eyeballed it. You're going to cut it all the way down the length of your trim piece. In my case, it's a yard. So that way you have two pieces. So during editing, I realized that I didn't tell you how much to cut the trim, and I forgot to mention that there wasn't going to be an exact measurement because I don't know what size boot that you're going to be using. So I just laid my trim across the boot and made sure to cut enough to where there was an inch of overlap. So I just held it across the boot and made sure that there was an inch overlap over the center seam. So that way I can fold it under and sew it seamlessly down onto the already tacked side. Now it's time to go ahead and pin the seam allowance. I used a 1/2 inch, but you can feel free to use as big or as little seam allowance as you want. So that way you can decide how wide or narrow you want your fur to show on the boot. Now that both sides are pinned, I go ahead and secure the seam allowance with some whip stitches. I go ahead and start on one end and continue down the other. I do most of this off camera to save some time. Now that all the sides are sewn up, I'm going to use this glue to kind of keep the fur from falling out. I wanted to use tacky glue, but this is all I had on hand and I didn't want to spend any extra money. So this actually did do the job. So I just went ahead and pushed the fur out of my way and then added glue to the ends where they would usually unravel. Now that the glue has dried, it's time to sew the trim onto your boot. So I sewed the bottom of the trim first, leaving the top part of the trim where the ankle is free for now. So I start where the boot already has a seam, and I try and use those holes that's already there as much as possible because it's kind of thick to push through. I'd recommend you use a thimble if you have one, but it's not necessary because I didn't use mine. So I start at the bottom of the trim on the center seam, and I sew on the inside. I keep my stitches close together, further apart, and on the outside where the fur is, I keep the thread very close together. So that way too much of the fur doesn't get trapped underneath the thread. So I'm gonna sew all the way to the bottom of the booty and all the way back up. And then when I'm done sewing, I will start on the top so that way I can secure the fur around the ankle portion. Now that we're down to the end, it's time for me to show you how to do the tongue portion. So I go ahead and stick the needle underneath all of the laces and underneath the tongue through the hardest part of the boot. And I sew, still working with the bottom of the trim, I sew that side down, making sure to avoid all the laces, and I'm just going through the tongue and the trim. And this way I secure the bottom portion of the trim and make sure that it goes across the boot and doesn't move. So that's pretty much what I'm going to do here. And it's quite tough to do. This part, I especially recommend that you use a thimble, but I'm trying to show you where I'm going to sew the bottom portion of the trim across. Make sure to leave the top of the trim free. Once you've sewn across the front of the boot, you're going to go ahead and sew up to the other side just like you did the first part, and then I will show you how to close up the back portion. Once you get closer to the center seam, you're going to overlap the trim onto the already secured trim. Now that everything is secured, it's time to go ahead and close in that raw edge. So I do that by just folding in the extra, and then I sew starting from the inside and do a couple stitches right on the bottom of the trim, just a few to get a good anchor on it. And then after that, I go ahead and sew with some whip stitches the loose end of the trim to the secured end of the trim. And I'm gonna just do that as many as possible, and don't worry about sewing down the fur because we're gonna pick those out a little and kind of fluff it out when we're done. Once you have your end secured, we're going to start stitching down the ankle portion of the boot, so the top part of the trim. So I'm going to sew from that corner all the way down to where the first eyelet hole is for the lace, and then I'm going to tie it off and stop there. Now it's time to secure the top portion of the trim to the top portion of the tongue. So like we did the bottom, we're going to avoid the laces at all costs, starting from the inside of the boot at the tippy top of the tongue, so just under the lace, and we sew from the inside, and we're going to sew the top of the trim, and basically I try and like squinch that down a little, kind of like bring it in a little so it's not too wide. Of course you can do this the best however you like to do it, but I tried to sew at that very edge of the top of the trim and sew it right across. Once I sew it across, I'm going to secure it on that corner, and then I'm going to sew across the top portion of the boot, starting from the top, the first eyelet hole for the lace, and back around to the center seam. I hope that makes sense, but either which way, I showed in the video. Right here is where I want you to secure it and tie it off, so that way you can start from the top center seam and sew back down to the first eyelet. Once the trim is secure, I go ahead and start brushing all the fur into one direction, as well as picking any fur that might be trapped under thread from when I was sewing. I also take this time to clean up the suede from any lint or free fur that might be on it. Once you do that, your boots are pretty much done. You also have the option of making like little trim pom-poms to sew on the ends of the laces. I decided to opt against that just because these laces in particular kind of come undone a lot, and I didn't want to have fur or wet pom-poms if I happen to be out in the element. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. It was really fun and easy to do. If you like more tutorials like this and just tutorials in general, please go ahead and like and subscribe to my channel, as well as follow me on Instagram at redribbonslim_, where I post pretty much every day on my story of what I'm doing and what I'm crafting in between my YouTube videos. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.